All right. Welcome everyone to our post-election post-mortem presented by the partners at Trendency, Lincoln Park Strategies, also J. Wallin Opinion Research, and the bnote.com. I am Charles Ellison. I am publisher of the bnote.com, and I have also been plucked as host of this exciting conversation that we're about to have as we're doing an autopsy of this historic election that has happened. We're actually, believe it or not, still even a week out from the election, we're still receiving data from it. We're still, everyone's obviously trying to make sense of it. For many people out there, it wasn't quite the result that they had expected. Particularly when we're going to talk a little bit about that because there was some data, before that election that was showing kind of like a different outcome, but we're going to parse through that, see exactly what that's all about, and see also what does that mean for. I'm real curious myself. What does that mean for the polling and forecasting industry as well? Like, what's that going to mean kind of in the future as we head into these future elections? We obviously on the federal level have midterms coming up in 2026, and then we'll have another presidential election hopefully in 2028. And so we're going to talk about that. We have two of the most eminent experts in public opinion research and polling and forecasting that I've known in my professional political and public affairs life. And definitely, I know that there are many other people out there who would agree. And I'll go ahead and introduce them. From my left, it's Stefan Hankin. He is president, CEO, founder of Lincoln Park Strategies, also founder of Trendency, which is another data-focused, data-heavy, data-intensive public research, public opinion research firm. So for more information, you can go to lpstrategies.com. You can also go to trendency.com. Great partners of the bnote.com. So he's here as well, helping us with this conversation. And also, another good friend of mine is Justin Wallin, founder, president, CEO of J. Wallin Opinion Research. Go to jwallin, JWALLIN.com for more information there. Both Stefan and Justin have been good friends for quite a long time, for more than several years, for it's almost a decade, I think. And actually in my former life, as a broadcaster, particularly on outlets such as WURD in Philly, would come on and talk quite a bit about what was happening in the public opinion space. So we're here to kind of break down exactly what happened with this past 2024 election. It's good to see you both.
Great to see you.
All right. So Stefan, I'll start with you. We've got the Electoral College, and we've also got the popular vote showing a very divided country. But the results, how would you describe these results? I mean, was this exactly a blowout by now President-elect Donald Trump, especially when you're looking at those three, what were called at one time, blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin? There was a difference of about only like 150,000 votes. So how do you see this?
I mean, both a blowout and not a blowout. So I think it depends on how you want to look at it. In the sense that Trump won every single swing state. So your blue wall states, Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina was talked about as being potentially close. Some of those were closer, some of those weren't. But from an electoral college standpoint, not all that close. This didn't just come down to one state that needed to flip. On the popular vote, they're still counting it. It keeps chunking down, and I think the latest estimate I saw is it'll probably be within 1 million votes, probably with Trump winning the popular vote. But we'll have to see once. I think it's mostly California, Oregon, Washington are the big ones that still need to come in that have some pretty decent populations where they're counting the votes. But I think, at least from my perspective and looking at the data that we had, that other folks had, the electoral college win wasn't surprising. I mean, certainly disappointing from the Democratic perspective. But before the election, multiple prognosticators, people who make predictions for a living were saying that there was an equal chance that Trump would win all 7 states and Harris would win all 7 states. The popular vote was a surprise, just given what we've seen. Republicans had only won the popular vote in 2004, and the last time they did it before then was 1988. We saw Trump lose the popular vote in 16 and 20, and if assuming he holds on and wins it by a little bit, I think that's where the big surprise, I would argue, is. And what's fascinating from a data perspective, I'll say, is that he's going to end up with about the same number of votes as he did in 2020, and with a much different result, obviously. So, I mean, if you had told me on the Monday before the election, Trump is not going to exceed his 2020 votes, I would have been, Harris is going to win this thing. I mean, are certainly going to win the popular vote. There's no way. But it looks like, a lot of Democrats likely, stayed home. We had a lot of shifts within different demographic groups, but still ending up at the same result. And it's going to take 2 to 3 more months before we get all the voter files updated and can really start digging into who turned out, who didn't, and learn more. But for right now, a bit of a head scratcher of exactly what happened on election night. But I think there's no way of saying it was a okay night for Democrats. It was definitively not a good one.
And what say you, Justin, as far as the Republican side, and were you surprised by those? I mean, was it as much a head scratcher for you as it was for Stefan on those popular vote tabulations?
Well, first off, I say that anyone who said that they knew what was going to happen walking into election day is a damn liar, as they say, because no one did, right? None of us did, and the polling was extremely close, and we anticipated to be very close. So all of it was within the margin of error, which means we have no idea what's going to happen. It's very human to kind of look at things and kind of see a bunch of little R's or a bunch of little D's in blue and kind of see 4 or 5 surveys that are 1 point up and 2 points up and say there's a trend. It's not a trend. It's inside the margin of error. We have no idea. So there's punditry that was saying that one candidate was up either at the popular or within certain swing states, but it just wasn't true. So what we were trying to do is we're trying to kind of sort through other trends that we were seeing, right? And we were all doing this. Whether that's the early vote returns and how that looked in terms of registrations and in terms of polling, how some changes were happening demographically that were changing the composition of Kamala Harris's supportive bloc. That was interesting, but none of us knew, and I certainly was surprised by the popular vote as well, because I will say this, that I did at 4 a.m. On my first hit of the day, I did say my bet, and underlining it was purely a guess, is that Trump would win the Electoral College, lose the popular vote. The Senate would be taken, which was not a difficult thing to project. There are no great epilogues for that. And then I said, I actually think that the House is going to retain as well. We'll see if that ends up happening. It's anyone's guess. But the movement that was underneath made me feel that was a worthwhile guess to have if someone's putting a gun to your head. But it's purely a guess. So the reality is, I wouldn't have been surprised if it went the other way. But I am surprised, as I think both you are, that the popular vote could very well end up being Donald Trump's. It's ahistorical. And then I do want to underline one other thing that Stefan began with in terms of, there's all different terms kind of thrown out, mandate. I saw one article that said this is a landslide of the modern era. It was in Politico, I think.
Yeah.
It's not a landslide. Let's be very clear about this. The reality, whichever side you're on, you're going to find roughly 50% of the American voting population who disagrees with you. So let's first off respect that reality, that we are a divided nation. We're one nation, but we're divided in terms of pretty much evenly in terms of where we feel with this presidency. The last landslide we have, let's contextualize that, was in 80 and 84, the 2 Reagan elections. And he won the first one by under 500 electoral college votes. Won the second one by 525 and 80% of the popular vote. That's a landslide.
Oh, yeah.
That's what we mean by a landslide, not winning by over 300. That is, I think you could arguably call that a mandate, especially if both houses are won. I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw. I certainly would be open to difference on it, but it's not a landslide. So this is very different than a landslide.
Mm, mm.
And I think, just real quick, what I find fascinating is now 9 of the last 10 elections, one party has lost something, right? So like the Democrats have lost the House, the Republicans lost the Senate, lost the White House, things like that, right? 9 out of the last 10, there's been a change, which is not a historical trend that we used to see. And then, if you look at also the past elections, I mean, almost all of them, except for, depending on how you want to look at 2022, but 2012 was a pretty, I'll call it boring election, and that not a ton changed, but everything else, right? Like 06 was a big Dem year, 08 was a big Dem year,
right.
2010 was big Republican, 2012 was boring, 2014 Republican, 2016 Trump wins, 18 Democratic landslide, 20 very good for Dems, 2022 again, depending on how you argue it, this good for Republicans. So I mean, the American public is swinging back and forth. Now the swing isn't big because, to Justin's point, like we are very divided. So a swing from 52 to 48 makes all the difference in the world. And if I was putting a bet on anything for 2026, it's going to be another swing, probably in the other direction. But again, not a Reagan level swing. I wouldn't put money on that.
Can I ask, so from just the perspective of a person who's not a polling scientist, of a layman observer, if you will, leading up to election day, you had about like 10, I remember seeing that. It was like a list of 10 of the leading forecast outfits, and among them like 538, Larry Sabato, right? Nate Silver, others. Then you had, I think it was like 9 out of 10 of those outfits, forecasting outfits, were all calling the Electoral College for Vice President Harris. And these are very reliable, especially when like Larry Sabato comes out with his crystal ball, you're like, oh, okay, like she's got it, and if it's 90% of those outfits, and these are pretty reliable forecasters are saying this, then you're saying, okay, well, this must be pretty much locked for Harris. There was one, I think it was Decision Desk HQ, which said, okay, Trump's going to have this. And the number, the Electoral College number, or by how much, it escapes me at the moment. I can't recall what they were saying, but then you had Alan Lichtman, right? Famous or infamous, however you want to view him, AU professor. He's always called these elections saying, yeah, she's going to get it. Others like James Carville, famous political strategist, going, day in, day out, she's going to win it as well. Obviously he was partial to Harris. So what do we make of that? What do we make of, sort of these forecasting or these prognosticators all saying, leaning in the direction of Harris, but then it coming out completely different?
Well, I'll jump in on this one to start, if that's okay. A couple things to keep in mind about that forecasting is an art of percentages, right? It's a gamble, right? So it's one way to look at it. It's why gamblers tend to be statisticians to some degree, even amateur ones, right? The thing to remember is that when someone has a 70% chance of winning, that means they have a 30% chance of losing. And I think one of the Nates said it quite well, is that when you're thinking about rain, and if there's a 30% chance of rain, you bring an umbrella, because it's more likely than not that it could happen, enough so that you don't want to ruin your suit. And so that when we're looking at these things, it's important, I think, to give the prognosticators a little bit of slack, that they can be wrong. Even I believe that their deltas were too wide. I'm not quite sure how that works, but they've got their special sauce, and that's their special sauce. But they're clearly wrong. But that is also, I will say, that's the way the math works, right? You're going to be wrong from time to time. Certainly in polling, right? You're going to be wrong depending on your inputs and your mathematical margins of error. You're going to be wrong, 3 or 4 times or more out of 100 that you do the same thing over and over again. So I think we do ourselves a disservice to look at them and throw stones, although I'm sure it's fun, right? It's good cocktail chatter to say those guys are idiots, but they're not really. They have fairly reliable programs, and sometimes the programs fail because we live in an uncertain world. But it was a challenge for those who kind of lined up. Given where the numbers were, again, with what I said at the beginning of this, which I understand sounds too overly simplistic, but it's true that when the polling is consistently that close, you have very little story to tell. And you start to look at other things underneath of the polling, again, ballot, returns and these sorts of things, trying to find other tea leaves. But those tea leaves are less reliable overall over time. So you're dealing with a degrading amount of certainty. And because we're human beings, we go from one thing that's more certain and we think, well, maybe this is it. And we see something there and we think, God, this has got to be something. It's big. There's more Republicans returning ballots early than Democrats. This has got to be it. Well, we all saw that, but the answer is maybe it's it, because it's never happened before. I mean, I'm a California guy. That just doesn't happen. Republicans don't turn the ballots in early. So what does that mean? Does that mean it's going to change things in terms of ballot returns, or does that mean they're simply cannibalizing their own votes? We don't know, because it hasn't happened before. So we're trying to pull all these degrading degrees of certainty together and stitch them into some degree of prognosis. And the reality is none of us really knows. That's, as unsexy as that is, that's pretty much where we are.
Yeah, Stefan, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think they're different, I'll call it styles or types of prognosticating, right? So the more certainty and defined inputs there are, the more accurate that prediction should be, right? So if you're thinking about like a card game and you see like World Series of Poker, it's like, look, we know there are 52 cards in the deck. We know exactly what the cards are. When you're watching on TV, we know what everyone has in their hand. So someone can, very easily figure out what is the percent chance that this guy will win, that, she'll win, he'll win, given the hand that's in, right? Still not a guarantee, to Justin's point with the umbrella, right? Like, just because you have a 70% chance of winning, that ace could come up for the other player and you could lose. But, it's just math, right? For a situation like that. Once you get into politics, you're dealing with, the inputs are mostly human based, and humans are really bad at like predicting what they're going to do and tell you in a way that is definitive, right? So, and that's everything from, are you going to vote, who are you going to vote for, and even, and I'm positive Justin does the same thing, right? When we're figuring out who to talk to, we're looking at what elections that they participate in the past, and we're factoring that in. But even the people who voted in 100% of the last 4 elections, 5 or 10% of them won't turn out this time. And we don't know who they are, right? And then if you think about the results, right, I think, and don't hold me to the exact numbers, I think 2020, it was something like 45,000 votes across 3 swing states could have moved it to Trump. And I think this time it was about 150,000 votes across the 3 blue wall states, right? What it could have gone to Harris, right? There is no list of, here are the 150,000 people who are going to turn out and make a difference that we can go talk to and try to figure out, what's going to happen. So, we're, to Justin's point, right? Like, we're taking the information we have, we're looking at past trends, and we're trying to figure out, sort of to the best of our ability, what's going to happen. And then the truth this year would have been very bad for clicks and headlines, which is, we don't know. We don't know.
It's not entertainment.
One way or the other.
It's not very entertaining at all. Right. We don't, and we just don't know. Like, I mean, we don't know who those new voters also who turned out. I mean, we do see. Want to get both of your takes on this. Going back to you can expound on your earlier point, because this leads to this point as well, Stefan. The new voters that turned out. New voters that turned out in terms of generations, in terms of also demographics that typically are viewed as just reliably Democrat, and so reliably Democrat too that they would not break for someone like Trump, in terms of Latino voters or Hispanic voters, Asian voters, Black voters, etc. Talk about that, and then I want to get Justin's take on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, I'd say as a industry, we do a disservice by putting too many groups together. Now, a lot of that is just a function of, we don't have the budgets or the ability to really break out Hispanic voters into, okay, what generation are you? Are a first generation immigrant? Are you second, third? What's your age? Are you, is your heritage Central America? Is it more, South America? Is it Caribbean? Like those kind of things, right? But we pull it all together because
it's more a language group than a racial group. Yeah, exactly.
And and like, look, we all know it, right? Like, regardless of what neighborhood you live in, if your neighborhood is, and it probably likely is, just given how we have sort of self-sorted in this country, right? But it's like, even if everyone kind of looks the same, everyone's different, right? Like different backgrounds, bringing different things to the table. But since we're in a larger survey, we're doing 1,000, maybe 1,500 people, so maybe there 100, 150 Hispanic voters in that. And those are probably 150 very different people, but we're pulling them together and just reporting it as, and this is where I think we kind of go wrong as an industry a little bit, is it just gets reported as fact, right? This is what Hispanic voters are thinking. And now, some of that could be the journalism on top of the polling, not the pollsters themselves, but it ultimately ends up happening. So, what I think where the challenge comes in now is just getting that understanding of, what do all these different things mean, and what do these turnout patterns mean? And, then it's also, does this year predict what's going to happen next year or 4 years from now? Probably not, but you never know. But, some people will look at it and say, oh no, this is it. That's the answer. But the truth is probably, we don't really know. And I remember in 2016, a lot of voters who turned out, they weren't necessarily like completely new voters, but I remember we were doing work in Ohio, and it was in this state senate district, and there was something like 15,000 people turned out that hadn't voted since like 2002, and this was 10 or 14 10 12 years later. And generally, we would, if someone hadn't voted in 10 years, we wouldn't include them in our sample to call, because it's like, well, they're probably not going to vote. But yet, these folks turned out for Trump. And I believe, and again, we have to wait a couple months, I think most of the story is going to be in the, not just who turned out, but who didn't turn out, and then ultimately trying to figure out the why behind that. But there was lots of shifts that are just fascinating, and we need more information to really dive into.
Yeah. And Justin, yeah, so really, the big new voters were the non-voters, right? Talk about that. Yeah. We need to explore that more in terms of these big drops in voter participation that occurred, particularly in some key groups.
Yeah, that was fascinating, because a number of folks said no thank you to either candidate, and that is a vote. That is action. And action's action, right? It's just a form of action. And why did they do that? We don't know, but we had significant numbers of African Americans who chose not to vote, it appears. We have significant numbers of women who chose not to vote. We have significant numbers of people from historically blue urban centers who chose not to vote. And why is that? That is what's going to be fascinating to find out. Of course, there's a challenge with finding out that, because that's usually not the purview of folks like Stefan and I, who are kind of thrown into a battleground that's almost more academic. And my hope is that those who do have the funding and the appetite to explore that do so with an open mind, because that's where things start to get a little funny, is when we apply our own lens to it. What really we should be finding out is just from the beginning, what did you like, what didn't you like, and explore that a little bit and do some introspection, because Americans are more nuanced and thoughtful than we give credit for. And oftentimes that answer is well worth spending a good amount of time, not just as strategists, but as human beings and as American voters ourselves.
We'll continue our conversation here, our election postmortem, just kind of trying to break down as best we can exactly what happened in this 2024 presidential election. There were some other elections that were taking place as well, too, federal, state level. But the big one everyone's paying attention to, close attention to, is what happened with this presidential election, this big matchup between now President-elect Donald Trump and also Vice President Kamala Harris, Republican and Democratic nominees, respectively. We have joining us, that was just Justin Wallin of J. Wallin Opinion Research, jwallin.com. Stefan Hankin is founder CEO of Lincoln Park Strategies, also Trendency. I'm Charles Ellison. I am your host for this conversation, your convener and publisher of the bnote.com, also principal of BE Strategy. So we're trying to kind of break down exactly, parse through all of this. How much more, Stefan, how much more change election can the American electorate absorb or take? Because 9 of the last 10 elections, you have a situation where a party has lost control of something. So talk some about that, and are we anticipating that kind of big change election? Could it be a landslide or a mandate of some sort, but are we anticipating some kind of big change when we come up for the midterms in 2026?
If past is prologue, yes. I mean, I think the only, and Justin might remember something else. The only year I can remember where that was, well, I guess 2. Like 2022 was a little different than normal patterns, and then 02 after 9/11 didn't follow the pattern. But typically, if a one party has a really good year, especially in a presidential year, the next year the other party tends to have a better year. But it's just because it happened in the past doesn't mean it's happened again. And then, a lot of what happens over the next couple of years is going to have a lot to do with who's more motivated, who's angry. I mean, we saw after Trump got elected in 2016, obviously Democrats hugely motivated for 2018 and took back control of the House, not the Senate, but gained seats in the Senate. And the House was a big gain. I'm totally forgetting that total number of seats, like 30, maybe. I don't know, but it was a big gain. So again, if that pattern holds, then that's what the expectation is of what we'll see in 2026. But I think also it's where do the parties go from here, right? So like obviously Republicans had a good night, but now I would argue, I mean, the Republican Party had been the party of Trump, but now it's official, right? Like there's no the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Katzingers are going to come back and sort of take back the party. The more, the sort of the more traditional moderate Republicans. This is the party of Trump. And then what does that mean over the next 2 years? And the Democrats just had a good ass whooping. And again, if past is prologue, we're not going to learn lessons, and we're going to really make some bad decisions and do a lot of infighting over at least the next year. But but it's sort of like what do the Democrats do next? How do we move forward? And I'm not personally buying into this is a wholesale realignment of the parties. I think it's a realignment for now, but I don't necessarily see it as like, this is what it is for the next decade necessarily. But as with everything else, I could be proven wrong about that one.
Yeah. Hey, Justin, sustained conventional wisdom will consider this a change election, and we'll be expecting, because with this incumbent party in the White House now controlling all 3 levels of government, we're expecting some kind of big change to happen in 2026. Will that be the case? Do you expect, another big change year coming up, since we've had like 9 of the 10 previous 10 elections being change elections?
Yeah, if you have to bet, you bet on the hot side of history, and it's a reasonable thing. I think that bet is improved given the nature of if all 3, if the Senate, the House, and the presidency are red, then Donald Trump's going to be able to do a lot of the things that he has said he wants to do. And while that may move forward a Republican agenda, and let's maybe be a little bit more clear about it, and I agree with Stefan that it will move forward a Donald Trump's vision of Republican agenda, it will have the effect of arousing the Democratic and Democratic-leaning independent side, because success at those policy items will annoy is a nice thing to say, but it will frighten the other side. That's usually what happens. And I think they have an opportunity to move forward a lot of things that are fairly large that will have that sort of insightful, agitative effect of the Democratic, certainly Democratic base. But more importantly, around the fringes, the folks who are in the middle, the folks who took a chance, perhaps, and voted for Trump this time, the folks who didn't vote, who said, I'm not going to. Those folks have a much higher likelihood of being activated given real actions.
Mm, mm.
I mean, and of course, the reality is there could be a degree of degradation of that simply by some folks who actually like what they see. But my hunch is that you will see more aversion to it, and we'll move back to the historical trend.
Got it. So we be real interesting. Are you all watching at all? Like, what also any buildup that could happen on the? I know we're talking federal level, we're talking presidential, we're talking about what's happening with the House and Senate, how that obviously will influence what happens in the Supreme Court as well, because there's some expectation that another Supreme Court seat might open up. We're not going to say exactly who, but we know that something may come over the next couple of years or next few years, but we'll see. We don't know. But are we watching how elections at the state level could bubble up and influence what could happen in the midterms in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, they tend to be somewhat tea leaves, but kind of sort of see. So let's see, next year Virginia will have a new governor. They just have a one-term governor, and that's always on the year after the presidential. Currently, there's a Republican in there. I think, Justin, maybe you know the number, but it's like once in the last, 20 years, the same party that's in the White House has won the governor's mansion in Virginia or something. It almost always goes in the opposite direction. So if you want to put some decent money, I don't advocate gambling, but if you were to gamble, betting on, I think it's Abigail Spanberger is going to be the likely nominee on the Democratic side for governor. She has a very good chance of winning now. And then New Jersey's the other one. And then, New Jersey was way closer than expected on the presidential level this year, but I would expect, a similar type of result there. And then, there'll be some special elections, right? Trump has already said that there are going to be at least 2 members of Congress coming into his cabinet, assuming they get approved. I'm assuming they will. So you'll have a couple special elections, one in Florida in a super Republican district. Not a ton to read in there. Right. I think Stefanik's seat up in New York is red leaning, but not massively red. So, that's one that's you can look at it and sort of see how motivated are the two sides. I think that's really all you can read on it. But just because, the race is much closer in upstate New York to fill her seat doesn't necessarily say, oh, well, then that's going to carry through. But, it's always the more inputs you can get, the better your predictions can be. So just kind of keeping an eye on anything that's happening at the state level can start to sort of inform an understanding of what the general mood is and how things are swinging.
Yeah. What were surprises here for you guys? And what wasn't so shocking, Justin?
For me, messaging had a lot of surprises in it. First and foremost, everyone knows everything there is to know about Donald Trump, right? So there's nothing new there. That game has been played out. In the meantime, we had a vice president who was net negative in favorability enter the ring, and within a matter of weeks became a contender. She became at parity with the Republican presidential candidate. I think that's an extraordinary win for her team. They did an amazing job of branding her, taking her from, maybe not an essentially unknown, but largely unknown who she was, other than simply being the vice president, certainly inverting her favorability or bringing it to parity. That was extraordinary. There was a challenge there that I was surprised that they were unable to make a break and establish an outline for the future. There's some things about that I will mention I think are good, character-wise, as a person. I think character-wise, to look at the person you just spent the last 4 years with in partnership and say, I respect what we did and I wouldn't have done it any differently. I think that is a good character trait. On the other hand, it's a failed opportunity. And there are ways to say I would change things and do things differently without throwing your partner under the bus. And unfortunately, the Harris team failed to prosecute that case. And at the end of the day, what they defaulted to was, I'm better than that knucklehead. And that doesn't win elections. It's something that I've counseled people in recall elections regularly. It doesn't matter how disliked or distasteful the incumbent, in this case, it's kind of odd because Trump's not an incumbent, nor is she, but let's use it as a proxy because it's reasonable. However poorly appreciated that person who's highly well known is, you can't just win an election by saying they're awful. You have to give them a home. You have to illustrate that home then uncertainty. That's your bar. It's a fairly low bar, but it's a meaningful bar. And that's what they failed to do. They failed to clarify uncertainty. And even, the night before the election, that final positive speech was not capitalized on. So much of it was about Donald Trump. And that's, I get it. You have to spend some time to kind of keep the base fired up. I do get that, but it doesn't win over those people who are in that middle, who are deciding whether I'm actually going to cast a ballot or not. I was surprised by that. I thought, given the extremely good performance of branding prior, they would have pivoted and illustrated a case fairly effectively, and they just didn't.
Yeah, I can see that too. It was like, try to, well, what can you? Okay, we understand you're telling us what the other guy does or did, but what can you do? Right. Yeah. And so and there was some issues there. I noticed a little bit of stumbling there. You can notice in the debate. I don't know what say you on that, Stefan. Did you find that surprising?
Yeah, I mean, I'll call it surprising, also tough, right? In that it is, to Justin's point, right? Like, it's a challenge to look at the president you've been with for 4 years and be like, he's terrible. Like, I would have done everything different. And also, like, there is always a lot going on in the world. And, I mean, some things we know, other things we're not privy to. And, if the vice president comes out and says, I would have done this very differently, or I would handle this situation very differently, like, that has implications around the globe, right? So, and you can look at like what's happening in Gaza, and she tried to indicate that, she had a slightly different opinion or would handle things slightly differently, but making a clean break on an issue like that is really difficult as a sitting vice president. Yeah. And because, again, it has that implication of what's actually happening on the ground. Right. So a tough situation to come into. Obviously had a short amount of time before the election. And it was like, what, not even 100 days or just over 100 days, to come in, kind of introduce yourself. And I think that there wasn't, I mean, you can nitpick everything, but I think in the broadest terms, the campaign seemed to do a good job, right? And I think, what's really interesting coming out of this campaign is Trump ran what would, at least in the textbook, be a terrible last couple months. Like the last 2 months, definitely the last few weeks. I mean, like, there's nothing he did that you would look and from like that textbook view, be like, that is a good call. Like, I see what he's doing here. That all makes sense. And, and the Harris campaign was running a very traditional, might be not quite right, but like what you would say, like, hey, like, look, they have the ground game going, they're running, they're spending on this media, they're doing social, they're, the mail, they're doing all the things that you're supposed to do. And, now the person who did the thing you're not supposed to do won, and the person who did all the things you're supposed to do lost. And like, what does that mean for campaigns going forward? And I'm not positive anyone else other than Trump can run the Trump playbook and be successful. I mean, maybe there's someone out there, but I think it's very unique to him. And, and again, I think on both sides, people will learn the wrong lessons and implement the wrong plans based on this 1 year.
Yeah, I want to go to the different battleground states. We had, and let's look at that real quickly. Those blue wall states again: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Looking at kind of what happened there. You look at those 10 largest counties in a state like Wisconsin, and Harris won those the same as Biden did, but she did it on an average less than Biden did back in 2020. And Trump doing almost a percentage point better on average than he did in 2020. So that's what we're seeing there in Wisconsin. What happened there? If you could get Justin those blue wall states, what are some other kind of surprises and not so surprising or not so shocking things or developments that you saw there? And where do Democrats and also Republicans go moving forward?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I still think is critical is that kind of sussing out why people didn't show up. One of the things that makes the news is those that are disgruntled with Vice President Harris's and the Biden administration's handling of Gaza is a group of voters who simply didn't vote for her out of protest for that. That has gotten a decent amount of news, a decent amount of visibility. I would be surprised if that was the reason that drove most or even a significant group of those who were leaning towards Harris to choose not to vote for either of them. Kind of those typical demographics that we see that I mentioned earlier that seem to really drop off in a meaningful way. Combine that with some increases in key demographics. One of the ones that, of course, got a lot of headlines on the news was amongst Black men. There's an increase apparently among those who are voting for Donald Trump amongst Black men. And why is that? What was about this message that he was conveying, or alternatively about the messages that her campaign was conveying that didn't resonate or did resonate? And then the big one to me is the continuing creation of this Latino, Hispanic if you're on the East Coast, Latino if you're on the West Coast, which just reflects exactly what Stefan was talking about earlier. We speak about this group as a block, and it is certainly not a block, and it behaves less and less like a block the larger it gets, right? This is a large group of people, and that behaves in a pretty dynamic fashion, depending on a number of different inputs based on the particular time of year of the cycle. However, you cannot get away from the fact that there was, a 10-point increase in Latinos who seemed to cast their ballot for Trump this time around. And that's a massive increase, and that's a massive change amongst Latinos in terms of being democratically aligned traditionally and being open to voting Republican. I think that's fascinating. I think the Latino vote, as large and nuanced and silly as it is for us to call it the Latino vote, but for lack of a better tool, we do these things, right? I think that will be the continuing and evolving story over the next couple of decades in America.
Mm-hmm. And Stefan, you talk a little bit about those blue wall states, especially really crushing defeat happened there in that Senate race in Pennsylvania, right, between Casey, the incumbent Senator Bob Casey, and then Republican challenger Bob McCormick taking him. That was just kind of like a stunning development to some. But talk about what was going on there, what kind of stood out to you, but then also moving on to those other states, Nevada, Arizona, Trump winning those, and then also Georgia, North Carolina, and then that interesting development in North Carolina where Trump loses it. I mean, Trump wins it, but loses it when you go down ballot to all those state positions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, Pennsylvania, definitely the outlier in that, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Trump wins, but the Democrat running for Senate wins by, varying degrees. But I mean, no one won in a blowout. Most were like really close. And it looks like Pennsylvania, although I think the New York Times, like just this morning, took Pennsylvania off the called list because it's getting closer and closer. And there's still, 150,000 votes to count. And they're within 30,000 votes of each other. So, we'll ultimately see what happens there. But interesting. I mean, the general patterns that I thought were fascinating on the blue wall versus some of the other states, like in the blue wall states, I mean, some like Wisconsin, there was a bigger turnout in Dane and Milwaukee than what we saw in 2020. And again, if you had told me that Monday, November 4th, that was going to happen, I'd be like, Harris is going to win. Like, there's no way she loses if that is a fact. But, then to your point, we saw some shifts of how much she won by. But then, you head south and you get into Georgia, and the movement was all over the place, right? So there, like 24 of Georgia's counties shifted towards Harris. 6 of those were Democratic counties, 18 were GOP counties, right? And that's a pattern we didn't see in other places. Like in Wisconsin, it was mostly all shifting towards Trump. But I mean, not massive amounts, but a point, and that all adds up. But now Georgia, we see movement in different directions. And, but then in the 10 most populous counties in Georgia, 6 shifted towards Trump, 4 towards Harris. So again, it's not, the math is not mathing until we understand who actually turned out, because it's like, look, on some of these, and this is similar to what we were looking at in the data right before the election, where it's like, well, if I look at these 3 things, I think Harris is going to win. If I look at these 3 things, I think Trump's going to win, which, as Justin said at the beginning, right, we didn't know. Like, there was just no like clear, this is definitively what is going to happen. And then, so when we look at some of these turnouts and these results, it's like, well, it wasn't just, oh, this is what happened. It was like, well, this is what happened in Georgia, which is different than what we saw in the 3 blue wall states. And then that's even more different than what we saw out west. And, out west, Nevada and Arizona had a lot to do with the shifts in, or it seems like, in the Latino vote out west. But, we're going to need time to dig into those numbers. But it is, I mean, there's just a lot of head scratching going on, because it's not a clear, it was just this one thing, and which also makes it tough for the campaigns, or especially the Democrats. When you win, you don't have to worry about it as much, but once you lose, what's the lesson? And there's not a clear lesson where like, oh, if they had just done this, it would have been a much better night.
Yeah. Let's talk about those lessons too. While we've got about 10 more minutes or so remaining in our conversation here in our autopsy. I'll go back to you, Justin, and then definitely want you to weigh in on this, Stefan. Like what we did already go a little bit into what you did, Justin. You're talking about what Harris did wrong here, or the perception of what Harris did wrong, and it's hard. It's very hard, running on an incumbent administration's record. Even with things, especially in terms of the foundational numbers, the economy is doing pretty good, right? And so it's just like, but people weren't feeling that on the ground. Once you take consumer prices, and for example, you take consumer prices into consideration. But where do Democrats go from here? Especially as far as the media information infrastructure goes, as far as like, okay, can you run a woman candidate again in the future? Can you run Can you run Kamala Harris again in the future? And also, where should they stand ideologically? Should they go further left, or should they go more center left, more moderate?
It's a tricky question, and that's the soul searching that right now certainly the Democratic Party has to do. And by the way, the Republican Party would be remiss if they don't sit down and really carefully look at what happened and do some navel gazing, because that's part of it. They don't really know how they got over the finish line. But it does seem to be that the working American was enough in support or not of Donald Trump and not in support of Kamala Harris to affect a win for Donald Trump. That's a pretty big deal. And it is true that the Democratic Party has long held the mantle of being the party of working America, and there's a dissociation and disaffection that is meaningful. And I think core to that, from the conversations that I've had, and this kind of gets to a lot of qualitative conversations that you tend to have over the course of cycles like this, whether it's in public policy oriented items or directly in political items, the things that hurt people that are meaningful economically may not be visible in a strong economy, right? We associate so much with a strong economy with certain statistics, the employment rate, the strength of the stock markets, interest rates, things along those lines. The reality is, if your income has not doubled in the past 4 years, you're doing worse than you were doing 4 years ago. That's a pretty dramatic thing. The costs of everything have increased so much. And we talk about things at the grocery store that have increased, but everything has increased. The cost of insurance has increased. The cost of fuel, yes, that's increased as well. The cost of homes, that's increased as well. You want to take a flight? You want to go see the family? They live on the other side of the country? That's 30% more, maybe 100% more, depending on what time you want to go. They're massive changes that make significant differences, and people are just not able to live the life that they wish to and make plans that they want to. That introduces stress, and more importantly, it introduces the fatality of all things in public policy and in business: uncertainty. And uncertainty, I think, was the killer that ran throughout this election. Why how can we be sure that we're not facing another 4 years? Because it really was difficult. And that sort of component, and again, I know it sounds like I'm oversimplifying things, but, and there's a whole constellation of other things. I get that. I mean, you can look at all the top different issues, the sanctity of democracy for certain Democratic voters that was very, very high. Abortion was continuing to be an issue, though certainly not as powerful an issue this cycle. Immigration an issue. All these other items, they all are iterative. They all have effect. But the fact that people are struggling every day, and that is not seen, at least they are not seeing it being perceived by their elected leadership, that creates tremendous disaffection. And I think that's the reality on the ground. And I think elected leaders need to recognize that and not just give it lip service and not just say, we know things are hard. Go spend some time with people, because it is really hard. The world is frighteningly more expensive now than it was 4 years ago or 10 years ago. And that's having a direct effect.
Yeah, Stefan, what do you make of that too? And in terms of how that's going to, obviously it's going to require some deep soul searching within the Democratic Party. Democratic Party typically viewed as aligned with and being compassionate for like that working man and woman, that working family, and those issues that Justin just laid out. But and also, where do Republicans go from here? Because I mean, can they actually survive post-Trump? Trump's not going to be around for too long. So, obviously eyes will start looking to J.D. Vance, his running mate, now his vice president elect. So where do they go from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's as with a lot of things after this election, right? Like big head scratchers. I mean, and I think, in the big picture, right, that this isn't just a US phenomenon. We're seeing this happening around the globe, right? Mm-hmm. So Japan, the incumbents lost. They were a center-right coalition. India, Modi is definitely to the right, but then lost seats in the latest election. The Conservatives got kicked out in the UK. So what we're seeing is mostly like there is unhappiness with what's going on, and I think I'm going to agree with Justin. Like most of this is coming down to how my life is right now, and it is difficult, and no one is necessarily talking to that. And look, if I keep the same, it's not going to get any better. So what the hell? I don't think it's going to get worse. So we'll try something new. Is a general attitude for a lot of folks out there. And where I think the Democrats, if I'm going to pick something that they failed at badly, and this isn't just the Harris campaign, but it's the connecting or expressing an understanding and to Justin's point, like in a real way that it's like, look, we should be taking victory laps on the overall economic numbers in the U.S., right? Like we have the lowest inflation, in the Europe, North America. Our unemployment rate is ridiculously low. Like basically all the economic numbers are in line, and it's like they ran a masterclass on how to get the inflation down. But at the same time, just because unemployment's low, just because inflation is down from where it was before, doesn't mean people aren't struggling. Now, I think from a pure partisan lens, Democratic perspective, it's like, look, this is the argument that the Democratic Party has been making for, going back to like the New Deal, right? Of like, it's big business bad, help the workers, we're the party of the workers, but they're clearly not, we're not doing it in a way that actually connects with the people that they feel the policies are going to benefit. And, if you can't make that connection, it's going to be real hard to have any kind of sustainable majorities moving forward. But then, to the question, right, like the Republicans haven't landed on it either, or else we wouldn't be flopping back and forth almost every election going over the last 20 years. So, it's both parties are not good. It's sort of like who's being the least worst right now, or who's getting blamed less for the bad things.
Yeah.
And what's on horizon for Republicans is the exact same turnout. All right, Americans are paying for the cost of government ultimately. That's what they're paying for. You start doing some little numbers and realize, I mean, in California, just a little under 1 out of 10, workers, employees are government workers, local, state, federal. It's an enormous proportion, right? That's an amazingly high cost. And these particular programs have massive funds to them. They're not like a private worker. Their pensions are different. And I'm not arguing that they don't deserve it. What I'm saying is it's expensive. And Republicans are talking about significant expensive features, things that I might like. I might want my taxes to go down. I would like that a lot. I think most people would like that. You cannot do that without cutting government commensurately, right? Maybe not exactly, because it's not a zero-sum game, right? If you grow the government, grow the economy, there's going to be more revenues that come in. There is that argument. And that is a valid argument. But it's not the only argument that works, because it relies on things that you cannot necessarily dictate. There's uncertainties around that. And I don't hear any Republicans talking about, other than a few Musk things, I'm going to streamline government. Republicans used to really talk about these sorts of things and own the space of we're going to make government work better and leaner. Now, whether they were good at that or not is a totally different question. I think a very valid question. But they're walking into a situation where they're going to spend a lot of Americans' money. And are they going to be good stewards about that? Or are Americans just going to have a hangover of debt they're dealing with right now? I mean, there's a lot of challenges that Republicans are looking at that I don't think they've fully sorted through.
Yeah, and what I find fascinating, this is a whole other conversation for another time, right? But we live in a binary political system. There are two parties, and it's going to be virtually impossible to really change that, just the way the system is set up. But then now we've moved more to we're a divided country, right? And then you have one side saying our economic policies work, the other side is terrible, and vice versa. But if either side were correct, there would be proof in the numbers, right? So most of our states are controlled by one party or the other, right? So if Democrats were specifically correct on everything, we should see Democratic states doing much better universally than Republican states.
Mm-hmm.
Some are, some aren't. And then the reverse would be true, right? If Republicans, or the conservative viewpoint, was 100% correct, then Republican-controlled states should be doing better than Democratic-controlled states. Also not true, right? So I think the honest answer, and this is not a bumper sticker or a campaign slogan, is we don't really know. Like, some of these policies might work, some of them might not, but nuance and deep thinking is not really what our political system is. So we get the soundbite and the I'm going to lower taxes, I'm not going to tax overtime or tips, and I can write down 6 different loopholes on those two policies that you drive a truck through. But we'll see what ultimately happens. But I think it's both parties work from a premise of we're right, the other side is wrong, without any mostly proof of concept.
Well, this has been quite a conversation. I get a feeling we're going to do part 2 and part 3. In fact, we like to say that this is the kickoff of a series of really important conversations that we'll be having between the 3 of us. We unfortunately ran out of time, and there's so much to go over, but that's okay. That's okay. There's a lot to talk about. So I'm sure by the time we get to the next conversation, there'll be a lot of ground to cover. That was just, I'm going to go ahead and end it there. That was Stefan Hankin, who is founder, president, CEO of Lincoln Park Strategies, also Trendency, a sister company, Trendency. Go to lpstrategies.com or trendency.com. Justin Wallin, there in the middle. Justin, J. Wallin Opinion Research. Go to jwallin.com for more information there. I'm Charles Ellison. I've been your facilitator, your host for this conversation. I'm at the B-Note, thebnote.com, also principal of BE Strategy. So you can catch me there, and you can catch this conversation. I'm sure it'll be spread out through our partner properties. But look out for us for the next conversation coming up real soon. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for participating in this historic election. If you did, And if action, if non-voting was an action, I guess like I don't know what to say. Thank you for not. But but just thank you for at least paying attention and acting in some way during this historic election and paying attention to conversations like these. We'll see you next time.